This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Talking next to a good friend of mine named Brian Domitrovic, who's one of the top economic historians in the United States. He's a frequent visitor to our show and guest on our show, works with Art Laffer at the Laffer Center in Nashville, Tennessee. He's written several great books, including The Iconoclasts, about the supply side economic growth movement that began under Ronald Reagan. And he also is the author of a book. I think it's the JFK and the Reagan Revolution. Is that the title, Brian?
Yeah, that's right. That's with Larry Kudlow. That's exactly the title.
Yeah, that's a great co-author to have, Larry Kudlow. So Brian is an expert on economic history of the United States, and I thought now would be a good time to re-educate everyone about why taxes are important and why cutting taxes is good for the economy, especially tax rates. So Brian, thanks again for joining. Let's start with the kind of history, if you could, of the income tax. A lot of people don't understand. For the first well over 100 years of our country, almost 125 years of our country, we did not have an income tax in this nation. And then that was was it the 16th Amendment that created the
16th? Yeah.
That created the income tax, which I think was one of our greatest mistakes ever. But the income tax, why did we get an income tax in the first place?
We got an income tax in 1913 because the nation had exhausted itself over debating the tariff for 120 years. The tariff debates really kind of tore the nation apart. And so they devised an income tax via the 16th Amendment in 1913 to lower the tariff.
So hold on, Brian. Let me just stop you right there because you said they devised an income. Who's they? Was it the progressives?
Yeah, yes and no. It was a big group. It also included a lot of rich. I mean, it passed by the arduous process of a constitutional amendment, which took 36 states back then. And the tariff debates had become so difficult that the proposition was, now that we've had an industrial revolution, we can have an income tax just on high earners, and they could basically pick up the nation's tax bill, and we can lower the tariff. What they should have realized, however, is that if they lower the tariff, that, of course, will have Laffer-Kurvik effects, and you'll get more revenue from the tariff, and you won't need an income tax. So it was a big mess up.
Good point.
Yeah.
So the one thing about the income tax that I think I learned from your book was that when they debated the income tax, I think the original income tax rate was 8% or 7% or something like that.
7. Yeah, 7.
7. So, the most amazing thing that I learned from reading your books was that we started at 7%. The politicians who passed that income tax and were the big advocates of it said, "Don't worry, it'll never go over 10%." And then 10 years later, we were at 70%.
Yeah, 4 years later. Yeah, I'm actually skeptical of kind of like the official history that the exchange with the tariff is the reason we had the income tax. The income tax ended up being terribly convenient for a nation at foreign war, as the United States was by 1917.
Right.
And my suspicion is it was actually planners on the part of the United States who envisioned the need for a domestic tax engine, which of course the tariff was not. So I actually think the coming of World War I had a great deal to do with the rise of the income tax. Yeah.
And by the way, I believe that being in World War I was a great mistake for the United States. We should never have been in that war in the first place. But I agree with you. It basically allowed the financing of America to send all these troops overseas to Europe and fight that war, which nobody even knows what they were fighting about to this day. But
the tariff revenue dried up immediately in August 1914. So it was uncanny almost that they had just started an income tax the previous October.
So then this is kind of a fascinating history, folks. I'm a history buff, so I love this. I hope you're enjoying it too. So we get the income tax in 1913. By, as you said, 4 or 5 years later, all of a sudden Woodrow Wilson, who I believe was one of the worst presidents in American history, he raised that tax from 7 to 60 or 70% or something like that?
77%. In 1918, it was 77.
So then we have the World War I ends in, I think, around 1919. And was there after World War I ended, did they lower the income? I mean, what happened after that? Because we had this huge income tax.
Yeah, so the top rate stayed over 70% all the way until 1921. It was 73%. 1919.
And by the way, we had a terrible recession, didn't we, in 1920?
Yeah, the Forgotten Depression, as James Grant calls it. Unemployment on modern reconstructions probably went to 19%. The price level doubled as well for the first time ever on a permanent basis, semi-permanent basis. Yeah, no, tax rates went absolutely crazy. And the one funny thing about that 73% rate, we talk about this in our book, Taxes Have Consequences, is that the left-wing economist, Emmanuel Saez, got a Harvard honorary degree for saying that the optimal top tax rate is 73%, the Laffer rate.
Who said that?
Emmanuel Saez, the big prize-winning economist.
Oh, right,
Berkeley.
Right.
He says he has an equation showing that the only time we've had a 73% rate, it was absolutely destructive of revenue, and we had the highest debt ever.
So we have so continuing with our history lesson here, folks. So we have that 70% plus income tax. Then we get Harding wins the election in 1920. I always have believed he was a very underrated president. The historians always rate him as one of our worst presidents, but he was one of the first advocates of an income tax reduction, was he not?
Absolutely. He brought in Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury, and over legislation over the next 4 years, so Harding and then Coolidge, because Harding died in office in 1923, the top rate of that income tax went down from 73 to 25%.
Wait, whoa, hold on. 73% to 25%?
Yeah, absolutely precipitous decline.
Oh, my God. 73 to 25%. Now, here is the crucial question for you, Brian Domitrovic. I'm talking to Brian Domitrovic, who works with Arthur Laffer, one of the great economic historians. Okay, Brian, are you ready? Are you sitting down? You've got your think cap on. All right.
You got
what happened to federal tax revenues after we cut the income tax rate from 73% to 25%?
Well, splendiferous things. I mean, at the top, tax payments just soared. I mean, because tax sheltering just came out of the woodwork big time in the late teens. So the United States ran a budget surplus every single year, 11 straight years, 1920 to 1930. And that was under the conditions of having the largest debt ever in American history. So there was just this consistent paying off of debt under the conditions of radically lowering the top tax rate. It actually is the single greatest example of reducing debt by tax rate, but by any means, and it's by tax rate cuts at the top.
So we saw a more than doubling of tax revenues, even though the tax rate was cut by over half, by 2/3.
Yeah. By 2/3.
That's amazing.
And the threshold for paying taxes went way up. So it really became a high earner tax and much lower at the top. I mean, radically lower than it had been.
Okay, so let's continue with. So we have the income tax under Woodrow Wilson. It causes a mini Great Depression in the economy in 1920. Then we get Harding and we get Coolidge. They cut the tax rate. The economy. We had the Roaring '20s, right? The great boom in the American economy. And then what happens? And then we get a Great Depression. How'd that happen? How did the stock market crash happen?
Yeah, I believe that it was Herbert Hoover's decision in late 1929 decision with that 10th straight year of surplus not to have another round of tax rate cuts at the top, but rather to have a tax rebate. He made that decision in late 1929. This Andrew Mellon, his Treasury Secretary, his plan to keep reducing that top tax rate has come to an end, and now we'll only have retroactive tax rates. So right there in 1929, Herbert Hoover announced, for all intents and purposes, that the floor of the top tax rate is 25%. I actually think that is the decision that caused the Great Depression, because from then on, with full certainty, as it turned out, global investors knew that high income will be taxed at minimum 25% from that moment on in 1929. And boy, were they right. Within a few years, the top tax rate was 63, 79%. And that just caused a suck.
And did that happen? So with the rate, hold on, the rate went from 25 to 70-some%. Was that under
Hoover and FDR? So as of January 1st, 1932, it was 63%. And then 1936, it was 79%.
Wow.
And Hoover had telegraphed that in 1929, saying we're going going to stop this top tax rate cutting. We're running a big surplus. We'll have a rebate. That was the signal, and that caused the pulling of capital out because tax rates are going to be higher. And sure enough, they.
By the way, I hope you're all getting our daily hotline that we put out at Unleash Prosperity. It is absolutely free. It is a great source of information about what's happening with the economy, what's happening in politics. It's very popular with members of Congress and CEOs, and you should be getting it too. And I'm not selling you anything, folks. It's absolutely free. Just go to unleashprosperity.com. I'm in the middle of a fascinating conversation with Brian Domitrovic, who's one of the top economic historians in the country and works with Arthur Laffer. And I forgot to mention your book. I apologize. You've written so many books, Brian, but your most recent one is Taxes Have Consequences. And who is the co-author of that book?
Co-authors are Arthur Laffer and Jeannie Finkfield.
It's a great book. And so we're kind of reviewing the findings of that book, which incidentally, what we're talking about, what Brian and I are talking about, we talked about for the last 15 minutes on the show, you're not going to get this in most textbooks, in economics books. It's just not taught. And so what I'm trying to do for you is give you real history, accurate history about why, how taxation works and why high taxes can have such a negative effect on the economy. Obviously, you need taxes to fund government. But what Brian is telling us is that the high tax rates on, quote, the rich have almost always failed. And we've gotten through the 1930s. Brian, you were saying that obviously Hoover and FDR were complete disasters with an 11-year-long Great Depression. And then we have World War II. And we come out of World War II and we have a tax rate that was near 90%, wasn't it?
Yeah, the top tax rate in World War II is 94%. That went down to 82%, but also the filing status was changed such that all of a sudden half your income was only subject to taxation. So there were very significant effective tax rate cuts by 1948, including about of 30% at the top.
And so then we have the next big thing that happens is that John F. Kennedy wins the election in 1960 against Nixon. Kennedy ran on reducing tax rates, which is kind of ironic because he was the Democrat and Nixon was the Republican. So Kennedy comes in, he endorses, what was his tax plan?
His tax plan was to have an across-the-board 30% rate cut because the economic growth had slowed to long term for 2.5%. And the top tax rate was 91%. Now, that said, total tax revenue was 16%. I mean, the corporate rate was 52%. The bottom income tax rate was 20%. The estate tax rate was over 70%. All these super high rates, government's only taking in 16%.
Yeah.
So there was just a culture of loopholes and deductions. Yes. I mean, tax sheltering was its, and Kennedy wanted the money out of the tax shelters and put into the economy more naturally, more organically. And he thought that would double the economic growth rate from 2.5 to 5. That's exactly what he got when he cut tax rates.
He got it. And so obviously that tax cut happened posthumously after Kennedy was assassinated in late 1963 when LBJ was president. And then we had a boom, right?
5%. It was the greatest boom. It made that the only reason we talk about a post-war prosperity boom is the 1948 tax cut and John F. Kennedy's tax cut of 1964. That's where all the growth of that era was located.
So then we get to so we're having a boom. And then why did we have that lousy decade of the 70s? The 70s were one of the worst decades.
Yeah, mega tax increases to end the 60s. Lyndon Johnson started a 10% income tax surcharge, and then Nixon
in the more late 60s, right?
Yeah, 1968. So just a reversal. You know, the Kennedy tax rate cut had worked so spectacularly. Johnson decided to reverse it by tacking on a 10% tax surcharge, and then Nixon kept that surcharge for a couple of years, instituted the alternative minimum tax in 1969. Tacked another 10 points onto the capital gains tax, which then when you went off the gold standard, that was unindexed for inflation. And the only thing he did was lower the earned income tax from 70 to 50. So for one tax cut, he had 3 tax increases. Then when you went off the gold standard in 1971, the entire system was unindexed for inflation, and the price level tripled, and that increased real tax rates phenomenally. And we had stagflation.
Yeah, so people got crushed by the bracket creep. More and more people were paying higher rates on their inflationary gains in income, and that was a disaster. And then, as to quote your and my guru, Arthur Laffer, the clouds dispersed, the sun came out, and God gave America Ronald Reagan. And then we've only got a couple minutes left. Explain to our listeners, and who we have some young listeners who weren't even around that. What did Reagan do?
Symmetrical to the 1920s. 1920s, the top tax rate was 73, went down to 25. When Reagan came into office in 1981, the top tax rate was 70. By 1988, he had it down to 28. Very symmetrical. And you had this long-term boom of standard 4-5% growth in the 1980s and 1990s under far lower taxes than had prevailed over the previous 50 years.
So, by the way, just so people understand, a 70% tax rate means that for every additional dollar you were earning, the government was taking 70, maybe 75%, depending on what state you lived in. So you were only keeping 1/4 of your money. So as Reagan said, why would people work? That people don't work to pay taxes to the government. And that's essentially what they were doing. So it was really hurting the economy.
Yeah, and the tax shelters. Rich people were finding all sorts of ways where they could hide their income. But when you have the people who are most adept at deploying their money, not deploying it in an economically efficient fashion, you'll have really slow growth. And when you cut the rates, all of a sudden there'll be a boom in investment and growth and jobs, and that's what he got.
So that's the story, folks. That is the story of the history of the income tax. It's a story of blatant, unforgivable mistakes. And yet here we are, Brian, just to round things out. We've got politicians like Mamdani in New York City saying, let's just raise the taxes on the rich. You got Democratic politicians who say, 50, 60, let's go back to 50, 60, 70% tax rates like Bernie Sanders and people like Elizabeth Warren. So it seems to me we have to keep teaching this lesson because a lot of people just don't get it.
In 1967, New York City implemented for the first time its income tax. 8 years later, it filed for bankruptcy. I mean, it's a very clear connection.
Well, I think maybe we should end on that, folks. So let's not have, if New York City raises its income tax by another 2 percentage points, it will be the highest tax place in all of North America to do business. And that means, if you tax something right, you get less of it, Brian. Thanks for joining us, Brian. Great. We should pay you tuition for your great analysis of what happened.